All right, it's time to get serious. You're welcome to follow along in your notebook. We'll start at tab number 1. I don't go slide by slide by slide, and we'll kind of jump around in there. But anytime I teach about supply chain logistics, there are 2 stories I always tell to help just introduce the subject as a whole. One of the biggest problems, and I think we mentioned this earlier, what was the probability of a logistics project being successful? 30%. Okay, if it involves software, it goes down to 15%. What portion of the people trained in logistics have any kind of formal education in logistics? 10%. Okay, in the U.S. Maybe it's different around the world. It's not necessarily higher. I guess when I go to Japan, maybe it's a little higher. But here's the issue with that. Well, we'll make it 3 stories to get this point across. One way I like to tell it is around the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, if you'd never seen the Golden Gate Bridge, okay, and let's say you're on a bicycle, okay, and you ride your bicycle up there, and there's no cars out, there's no buses out, there's nobody around, it's just you and the bridge. And you're trying to decide whether to go to the other side or not. And you look across and you think, well, if I could just get to the other side, the view back across the bay must be absolutely spectacular. In fact, Sean's from San Francisco, so he knows. I mean, if you've ever been there, it is absolutely spectacular. You know, but it's a little nervous because you look down and it's a long way down there, right? And there's rocks and waves and freezing cold water and sharks and I don't know what else they have down there. So you're trying to decide, and so you're scanning around looking for some bit of information that would help you figure out, should I go across that bridge or not? You've never been across a bridge. And you look down and there's a little plaque. And it talks about the person who designed the bridge and managed the project. Okay, and it says that they barely graduated from high school and, you know, they have an art history degree, you know, a certificate from someplace. And what did that just do to your thoughts about going across the bridge? If you're me, I'd be scared to death. I'd be hauling back the other way so fast it'd make your head spin. Okay, what would you like to read on that plaque?
Some kind of engineer that wanted an award for something.
Yeah, civil engineer, mechanical engineer from Georgia Tech, right? I mean, that would be the. You don't have to have the Georgia Tech piece, but you get the point. The reason I use a bridge is logistics is like a bridge between your customers, between your organization, your plants, your vendors, etc., and your customers. It could be a software bridge. It can be a physical bridge. It could be an outsourcing bridge. Okay, logistics is about connecting things to one another. Unfortunately, at least here in the United States and in most of the other parts of the world I work in, most of those bridges have been built by people who have no training in that bridge building. So it's no wonder the rate of success is so low. So that's why we started the Supply Chain Logistics Institute here. That's why we wrote books about it. And part of the other problem I find is that nobody has a definition of what logistics is. So we're going to spend 3.5 days studying supply chain logistics, and there's really not even a solid definition that people can hold on to. And the reason that's so important is there's a phenomenon in project management called scope creep. What's scope creep? And it's not a weird person who uses mouthwash, you know. What?
Well, the definition of the project goes outside of what the intended deliverables or what the scope of it was what the actual project was supposed to be. It ends up being outside of that. So you agree on this is going to be a deliverable, this is going to be a deliverable, this is going to be a deliverable, and then it ends up being...
Yeah. Okay. There's some definition of the activity, and it's that the project is supposed to address. And people start adding to that, and all of a sudden, what the project was designed to do doesn't look anything like what you wind up with in the end. And the more you add to the definition, the lower the probability of success.
Have you seen that slide with the swing?
I've not seen that slide, but I've seen...
There's a slide that says this is what the customer described to you as what they wanted, and it's a swing, like on a rope swing. And then it ends up being, this is what you understood they wanted. It's a tire swing, and then
Now I know what you're talking
ends up
about.
being like a golden share at the end.
Right. That's a good description of it. So we need some type of definition to hold on to, and we need a framework to work through these issues. So I always start with the definition of logistics. What is this all about? If you get this for the next few minutes, it'll be worth your trip here. That's what I find. Then maybe we'll just go play golf or something. There are two stories I like to tell around this. One is much older than the other one. The first one is around a client project that we did back in 1990, I guess it was. We were working with a large food company. And we were helping them create a supply chain strategy. And we made a recommendation to them that they create a supply chain organization. And that's a pretty typical recommendation that we make. And so they accepted the recommendation, and then they asked me, well, Dr. Frazelle, would you be willing to facilitate the first meeting? Well, I'm from the South. I mean, you can't recommend that there be a group of people and then say, no, I'm not willing to meet with those people. I'll say, of course, I'd be happy to facilitate that meeting. So the meeting started at, it was, I think, a Thursday morning at 8 in the morning. And it went well for about 6 or 7 minutes. And it kind of broke down after that. And it started to sound something like our minivan sounds about 5 hours into a trip. It was he said, she said, he touched. Okay, and these are six-figure executives, and they're going at it like this. And I'm thinking, well, I'm really doing a bad job facilitating this meeting. I'm going to have to give my consulting fees back to them because I'm doing such a bad job. To be honest with you, I would have been delighted to give the fees back, if I could just get out of this meeting. But I couldn't do that, and this went on for about an hour. By the grace of God, there was a break at 9 in the morning, 9 o'clock. So I remember getting out of the thing going, and Lord, what am I doing wrong that I can't get these people to work together? Or Lord, what's wrong with these people, that they can't get along even for an hour? And then it dawned on me what the issue was. Because we had done intros, that morning. There were 8 people there that day. So we had the head of manufacturing, we had the head of transportation, we had the head of warehousing, we had the head of materials management, we had somebody from finance, somebody from marketing, somebody from IT, and the nephew of the chairman of the board. Okay? That's who was there. None of which had ever worked for another company. And here's the kicker. None of which had ever worked outside the function they were in. And the tenure, is 8, 10, 12 years. So if this gray-headed guy from Georgia Tech shows up, and he starts talking about logistics, and you've worked in that warehouse all your life, what do you think he's talking about? Well, probably warehousing, because that's the only window you have ever seen the world through. And the same thing in transportation, and the same thing in IT, and the same thing in manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. So when I went back in the room, I called timeout. I'm a sports guy. So I said, okay, guys, timeout. We're not going to have a discussion anymore. And they're like, oh, my goodness. So we're going to have a lecture for an hour about what logistics is. From that point on, every time we start a consulting project in this, we begin it with training. All the work we did with Honda began with a huge training program on what supply chain logistics is. The group down at Disney, they've all been through all of these courses. When we took BP through this, Hallmark cards. So we just started with that foundation. The reason actually goes to a much older story. This is a really old story, all right, but this gets the point across better than any way I've been able to get it across. This goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. All right, you remember Adam and Eve? You do. Okay, you're really old, Joel. All right. Wow. Okay. So anyway, Adam and Eve, they had a lot of advantages that we don't have, but one was they were speaking the same language. They were inventing the language as they went along. And then they taught that language to their children and their children's children, and that went on for several generations. So if you've got an entire generation of people and there's only one language, you can communicate very effectively. And so information spreads efficiently, and scientific developments happen much more efficiently, and art develops much more efficiently, much more beautifully, really. And we think we're fancy with cell phones and wireless internet and all the technology that we have, nanotechnology. They weren't doing bad either. They had urban planning. They had musical instruments. They had art and science. And one day, the society decided to celebrate all of their success. Does anybody remember what they did? Anybody remember? Who said the Tower of Babel? Someone, okay? They wanted to build a tower. Okay, the idea was they were going to get this thing all the way up into heaven. All right? And one day I was reading this story. You know how sometimes you're reading a book or reading a magazine or the newspaper and something just jumps out at you? A sentence or a paragraph? So I'm reading along, you know, and God is speaking here. So I thought, well, that's a pretty good source. And he says, looking down at this, if they can speak the same language, there's not anything they can't accomplish. I thought, let me read that again. Did I get that right? If they can speak the same language, there's not anything they can't accomplish. So I thought, you know, that'll work in a family. That'll work in a sports team. That'll work in a business. I got so excited about that, I went and wrote the most boring book probably ever written. It's called The Language of Logistics. It's now a website, okay, and it's hooked up into different corporate websites as they're trying to look up words in logistics. To drive the point home one more time, the people kind of forgot who gave them the ability to do all these great things. So God had to do something to help them remember. Right? What did he do? He confused the languages. Okay? So all of a sudden the person with the drill press couldn't talk to the person with the hammer, couldn't talk to the person with the screwdriver. I don't know what tools they had back then, but you get the idea. And they got about halfway up with this project, and literally it says the people scattered. And that's what happens with a lot of these logistics projects. They get started, and everybody's all excited about it because they see the potential in it, and then something breaks down in the communications because they don't understand what the other's trying to accomplish, and the whole thing is abandoned. Across the street over here, okay, at Coca-Cola, they tried to get a global logistics group together. Same kind of thing. In fact, they called the project Project Infinity. I suggested that's probably not the best idea in the whole world, okay, for that project, because it, you know, cost infinite and took infinite, etc. But anyway, they tried, and the politics of the company just ate the thing up. So it's not easy to get these projects over the goal line. A lot of it goes down to, do people understand what the other group is trying to do? Because inherently, logistics is trying to connect sourcing and manufacturing and customer service and do all of that to maximize the financial and the service performance of the company. That's what logistics is about. And if you don't get that, you're going to have you're going to struggle with this. Somehow people have gotten in their minds that logistics is all about how can I spend the least amount of money possible on transportation? How can I have the least amount of inventory possible? And what we're finding is, what you really want is, what's the right amount of transportation, what's the right amount of inventory, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what we're going to be studying this week, is how you figure that out. If you didn't come for that, we're in trouble, because it would be hard to change all of this at this point. Okay, so